In this video, we're going to create a form in our app for adding friends. We'll learn about lots of cool Quasar components along the way, and I'll show you how we can easily refactor a form into its own file. All right, let's begin. First of all, we're going to clean up a couple of things in the index page. Let's get rid of table component and full screen here. We'll get rid of this icon, and we'll get rid of everything inside of the table except for columns, rows, and the title. Save it. I'll get rid of the button inside of the top right, and then I'll put a comment in here. The reason I put the comment in there is if I don't, then the linter is automatically going to close that tag. We're going to be adding something there later on, so we're going to put a comment there so that the linter doesn't close it. Next up, let's change this from flex to row. That's just going to make this video a little bit easier to understand. We'll have the table on the left and then a form on the other side of the table. Scrolling to the top, let's just fix up a couple of these linting errors. We'll get rid of that import and the ref import. And we are good to go. Okay, underneath the table, let's add a Q-form component. This is what we use to create forms. And now we're going to add some comments for the inputs that we'll have in that form. This form is for creating new friends. So we'll need the name and the email, but we're also going to add a few extra fields. So let's say name, that's going to be a text input. Copy paste that down because the email will also be a text input. Now the other one we'll have is age, and that's going to be a number input. Next, we're going to ask if it is human. Sometimes my dogs like to think that they're human, but they're not, so this would be false, and then that's going to be a checkbox. Operating system. This will give us the chance to create a select component, and we'll also have a color, which is going to be the color picker component. And then lastly, we need a create button at the bottom here. Okay, now we need a place to model everything in the form. So let's just come up here and say const form is equal to a ref, which is an empty object. Make sure ref is imported, and we are good to go. For the name field, we can use a Q-input component. And then I'll do a v-model on that, which will be form.name. Save it, and maybe we'll create a little bit more space here. And by default, it's just a line where we can enter some data. So to make it look a little bit better, let's add a label as well, and we'll set that equal to name. And we'll also make this filled. Quasar's inputs have a few different designs. I really like the filled style. You can also do a few others like outlined. Or if you want to do something more from scratch, you could say borderless. Okay, so let's go back to filled. And before we move on, how about we put all of this inside of a card with a card section? So I'm going to just click on form here, Control-Shift-P, wrap with abbreviation. And now we can say Q-card, arrow to the right, Q-card-section, enter. That's a really quick way that we can essentially wrap something with whatever we like. So let's save that. Yeah, I think that will just make it a little bit nicer to work with. So now that we have the input, let's copy paste this down for the email since it will be quite similar. And then we'll change name to email for what we're modeling and the label equal to email. The next problem we have is that these two inputs are pressed up against each other. So what we can do is on the form, add a class equal to Q-gutter-y-medium. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about utility classes later on in this series. This is one of the ones we get out of the box with Quasar. We're basically saying, hey, Quasar, add a gutter inside of this form, only on the y-axis, and make it a medium-sized gutter. So we can save that, and then you can, of course, make this large. You can make it extra small. There's a few different options we have there, but I think medium looks fine. Next, we'll add the age. We can copy paste this again and make a few tweaks to that input. So instead of vModel, we'll do vModel.number. This is a view thing that basically automatically converts the input to a number. So by default, if I were to type a 7 in here, it would input a 7 as a string. So this is a super helpful modifier. All right, let's change this to age, and then the label will be equal to age. And we can also set the type of this input equal to number. Now, by setting the type to number, it means when we click on here, we get these little native arrows where we can increment and decrement. And it also just looks a bit nicer on mobile. If you were to touch this input on a mobile, the number pad would show up. So it's a little bit easier to type in. That's why we have the type equal to number there. All right, pressing on, we want a checkbox for is human. So of course, that is just Q dash checkbox. We can then model this form dot is underscore human. And let's give that a label. Is human. That one's pretty straightforward. Next up, we have the operating system. And this gives us a chance to look at the select component. Q dash select. So we can v model form dot operating underscore system. Save it. And notice this is very similar to a Q input. In fact, they use some of the same code under the hood in order to get their styling. So a lot of the stuff you can do with a Q input, you can also do with a Q select. For example, we can say field here to get a field design. Or in this case, let's make it a bit different and use outlined. I like doing this where some of them are filled, but then if it's a select menu, it's outlined. To me, it just communicates to the user that this is something a little bit different. All right, let's put some options in there. Options. And the most basic use of this component allows us to just pass through some strings for the options. So let's say Windows, Mac, and Linux. Save it. And now if we click on here, we can select an operating system. Moving on to color. Q-color. This one's super simple. V-model is equal to form.color. And I don't think we even need a label for this because it's pretty obvious what this component does. Now, of course, we're going to need a button so that we can go ahead and submit that form. Q-btn for a button. And let's set the label equal to create. I might even give it a color equal to primary, just so this button stands out a little bit. And if we scroll down here, there's that button. And we have a Quasar utility class of full dash width. So I'm going to full width that button as well. I just think it looks a little bit nicer. Now, since this button is inside of a form, we can set the type equal to submit. And that means when this button is clicked, it's going to submit the form. So what we can do now is hook into that by saying @submit. And then when this form is submitted, we can then perform an action. So I might actually just leave that out for now. We're going to add it in a moment. Next up, we need a way to store this data. And rather than using a backend API, which would go way beyond the scope of this video, we're going to use local storage. And there's a package called ViewUse that allows us to very easily sync a ref with local storage. Let me show you what that looks like. So we'll say yarn add @viewuse/core to add that package. Now, when that's installed, we can come back, scroll to the top, and then we can import this composable that allows us to sync our friends with local storage. Import, use local, and it's showing up already, so I can press tab and get that imported. And now rather than using friends here, we're going to say const friends is equal to use local storage. And the first parameter is what this will be called inside of local storage. So the key that is used to identify this data. Let's set that equal to friends. For larger applications, you might want to make this more specific. But for what we're doing here, I think a key of friends is just fine. Next up, we can give it some default data. And we're actually going to make this an object. Now, the reason we make this an object instead of an array is that it's easier to manipulate data inside of an object than it is in an array. That will start to make a little bit more sense throughout this series. For now, let me show you how we're going to store friends. The object will look something like this. An ID, so sum-id, and then that key is going to equal the object of the data. So it will have the ID again like this, sum-id, then it would have the name, and then it would have the email. So that's what it's going to look like to store our data inside of Friends. This might be a bit different to what you're used to, but trust me, working with objects rather than arrays is much simpler, and I think you're going to notice that throughout this series. Okay, so let's get rid of that and push on. Next, you'll notice that things aren't working right now, and that's because our table currently expects an array, but it's getting an object. So what we're going to do is come down to the table, and instead of sending the friends through directly, we're going to say object.values friends. This basically takes an object and uses the values of that object to create an array. So now we have an empty table of friends and a form that's ready to start adding friends in. So let's go ahead and write that logic. Scrolling up here, this is the fun part. Function create friend. First, we need to generate an ID. Const ID is equal to, and if we say UID here, you'll notice that Quasar actually gives us a UID generator. So pressing tab, we can go ahead and call that to generate an ID. Next up, we can say form.value.id and set that equal to the ID that we just generated. And now we can say friends.value ID is equal to form.value. So again, let me just go through what's happening here. Usually, you're probably used to doing something like this. Friends.value.push when you've got an array, and then just pushing it directly onto the array. We're using objects instead to manage our data, so it looks a little bit differently. Now, we can come down here and say when we submit the form, then I want to call the create friend function. So for each input, we're updating the form, we update the name, we update the email, we're gradually building up our form. And then we hit the submit button. And when you have a button with type submit, that calls the submit event on the form. So when we hit that button, this event gets hit, and then the create friend function is called. So coming up here to that function, we generate an ID, we use that ID on the form, and then we also use the ID as the key on our friend's object. And that is set to the value of the form. So feel free to watch those last 20 or 30 seconds just to make sure that you can understand what's going on here. And let's go ahead and fill in this form. For the name, Lugu, because that's my nickname, luke@ldball.com. I'm 33 years old. I am a human, and I like to use Linux. Scrolling down a bit, let's choose a color. I like these kind of aqua colors or teal, whatever you call that. And let's go ahead and press create. And there we go. It now shows up in our friends list. And since friends, if we scroll up a little bit here, since it's using use local storage, and I might actually cut that and bring it closer to the rest of our form-related logic, since it uses use local storage, I can now refresh the page and all of our data still exists in this table. And check this out. If we do Control-Shift-I, and then we go to Application, Storage, Local Storage, and then we click on our site, you'll notice that this is the ID that was generated for our friend. So the key is equal to friends, and then here's the data. And if we open that up, here's everything that we entered in there. How unbelievably cool is that? This is so cool for prototyping because now we can just refresh the page, and all of our data is still there. So when you're first playing around with an idea for an app, it's really cool to just use local storage, and then we can pair that with the use local storage plugin from Vue.use. And really, it's just like a ref that sticks around when we refresh the page. So now whenever we change something to friends, refresh the page, it's going to repopulate straight away. I think this is such a cool concept and a great way to prototype apps.